Chapter 12. A Time for Answers. Eliza Beth sat on the back steps most of the morning. She reclined back and watched the high fluffy clouds float past. The little girl remembered times, which seemed ages ago, when she watched the clouds with Johnny. He always tried to get her to see some shape or another in the clouds. She always told him it was silly and always pointed out how there was a part missing here and an extra bump there. Eliza wished Johnny were here now to explain the shapes to her. Despite her obstinacy, sometimes she really saw the shapes when he explained it. But now she only saw big fluffy balls of cotton. Some days almost everything made her think of Johnny, and she realized, or started to, how much he did for her. Her quiet reflection was interrupted when Alice opened the door and exclaimed, "Eliza Beth, quickly! Miss Johnson wants to speak to you in her office." Eliza didn't immediately acknowledge Alice's command. Alice first wondered if Eliza had heard or understood. She couldn't see the look that passed over Eliza's face, mouth gaping open. Then Eliza repeated slowly, almost in a whisper, "Her office? She's never asked me into her office before. It must be something really bad. Alice, will you come with me? I'm afraid." "Not a chance," Alice chided. "I don't like going in even when it has to do with me. Whatever she wants, it's for you and nobody else." Alice's memories of the time she spent in the office were not very pleasant. When she first came to the home, she gave them many leads on possible aunts, uncles, and other relatives. It seemed like every other day she was called into the office to be told of another dead end. Many of the aunts and uncles she supposed she had turned out to be merely friends of her parents, and all the other leads only turned up headstones at cemeteries. Eliza walked very slowly while wondering, have I said something particularly mean to anyone today? Or is it something about Johnny? Or am I in trouble for something? All these thoughts swirled in her head. Finally, she found herself standing in Miss Johnson's office, though honestly she didn't even remember walking down the hallway. Miss Johnson seldom used the office except as a place to keep the records and occasionally to hold meetings with other important adults, or to discuss things that she didn't wish the children to overhear. There was too much to do for Miss Johnson to chain herself to a desk. It was very rare for her to ask a child to accompany her into the office. It usually meant something very serious indeed. Various filing cabinets, an old desk with a high-backed chair behind it, and two small cushioned chairs in front filled the small room. Miss Johnson sat behind the desk with her hands resting on the only bare spot. Stacks of files and papers took up the rest. The matron was distracted in thought, appearing to look far away out the window. Eliza swallowed hard and slipped into the nearest of the cushioned chairs. Miss Johnson made eye contact with Eliza Beth as she entered the room, but said nothing and returned to gazing out the window. Eliza looked out the window herself and saw that it only looked upon a particularly high part of the fence. The room was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. After a long pause, Miss Johnson said, "I think, Eliza, that it's finally time to answer some of your questions, though I've not heard you ask any for a long time. Please go and close the door." "Miss Johnson," Eliza stammered, "I don't think I'm ready after all. Maybe tomorrow would be better." For so long she wanted to know the answers, even begged and pleaded to be told the answers. And now for Miss Johnson to just offer them up unbidden seemed such a shock. The office suddenly felt small and confining. The air was all stuffy and she felt very alone. She wished more than ever that Johnny were there, but he was off beginning his new life. "It'll be all right, child, although I imagine it'll be difficult to take." Miss Johnson spoke a little softer as she rose and shut the door herself. She thought very long about how to handle this moment delicately, but now it seemed impossible to soften the shock she was about to deliver. Returning to her seat, Miss Johnson began by repeating some of Eliza's questions. "In times past you asked how you came to be here at the orphanage, why you didn't seem to belong here like the others, what happened to your parents, why Johnny chose you out for special care. So many questions. I'll tell you the best that I can. Just listen now. No doubt you'll have even more questions afterwards." Miss Johnson tried a few different ways to start, but they always seemed to lead in a direction that Miss Johnson thought confusing. All the starts and stops made Eliza even more anxious about the answers. Now she began to understand that one part of not answering her question was that people didn't know exactly how to answer them. After a few moments, Miss Johnson stopped and briefly returned to staring out the window. Then she drew one long, slow breath and said, "Let me start this the way it came to me. Let me tell you from Johnny's perspective. That'll be best. I reckon that you'll begin to see how you fit into it on your own. One day when Johnny was only 12 years old, he'd been up to Old Miller Park. If my detective work is as good as it used to be, this is the same park you tried to sneak off to a while back." Eliza was amazed Miss Johnson knew about the trip. Miss Johnson continued, "It was just after dusk and he should have been home, but he'd seen men gathering in front of the park. They were in white robes and had white hoods pulled over their heads. Because the hoods hid their faces, he didn't know who they were, so he thought it best to disappear into the hidden path that led into the woods. Johnny waited for some time just inside the wood, but more men just kept coming. He was close enough that he could hear them talking. The leader told them things like, 'Come on now, we've been talking about this for a month. You're all not getting scared on me now, are you?' To which one man replied, 'I don't like it at all. The man has never done nothing to me.' The leader scolded, 'Oh, now don't start, Phil. They'd be much happier with their own kind if they only had the sense to see it. Think of it as us doing them a favor if you wish.' Johnny stayed long enough to figure out the men were up to no good before he decided he had best just use the path despite the darkness. A black family worked a small farm just a mile outside of Townsend city limits for almost 10 years. The original family became too large for such a small parcel and moved further west, turning the old farm over to a nephew and his new family. Homes began to go up beside it and across from it as the town grew. Even the old grist mill for making flour was gone and had been turned into Miller Park. Because of this growth, the town council voted to extend the city limits to include the park and the old farmstead. Before this, no descendants of slaves ever lived in town. People forced them out into these poorer rural areas. By the time the town expanded its borders, all had moved on to more accepting places and only the one family remained. People didn't like living next to people that were different, and many wanted them to move away even though they had been there first. In fact, the Ku Klux Klan, which these men were a part of, was devoted to driving off all who were different. Some differences these men didn't like were different skin colors, people from the wrong parts of the world, or sometimes just because of their last names. This local group of Klansmen decided it was time to do something about this particular family. Or at least their leader decided that they would. One tactic they used to scare people away was to burn a large wooden cross in the people's front yards. That's in fact what they were up to that night. Johnny had already begun to slip down the trail before they took the cross out of the back of a truck. He didn't see them start down the road with it. He was too busy trying to pick his way down the trail without making a sound, because the trail was so close to the backyards for the first block or so. The trail just happened to break out behind the home of the black family before entering again on the other side of the property. Johnny stayed just in the edge of a row of trees, running in the shadows where no one could see him. As he passed directly behind the house, he could see what was going on. The men were hooting and hollering while passing around and drinking from a bottle in a plain brown bag. Meanwhile, the cross fell over into a pile of leaves that had blown right up to the porch. In this way, the home itself caught fire. Afterwards, there were rumors it was the leader's plan all along, particularly the firemen who said they'd never seen a house burn quite like that one. Others said it was accidental and only meant to frighten the family. Whatever the leader's motive, many of the prominent men of the town were in a rather somber and solemn mood the next day. People wondered if some of them knew more than they were telling. For a moment, Johnny was too terrified to move in fear of what he saw the men doing. He thought the light of the flames might give him away. He just gathered his wits and was about to run off when he thought he heard a sound. Something about it made him stop and listen. At first he hadn't known what it was, but he realized that he could hear the cries of a baby over the noise of the men in the fire. He knew babies. He'd helped with many in the home, and he knew how helpless they were. He tried to tell himself that the parents would get the baby and leave. There was no need for him to do anything more. He was just a child and the men were adults. With the mob, the liquor, and the raging fire, there no longer seemed to be any timid men among them, and they were much more threatening now. Johnny said to himself that no one would expect him to do more. There was, however, one person who thought he ought to do more. Himself. He quietly ran up to the back of the home, being careful to remain unseen. Once he looked inside, he saw the parents struggling with the men on the front porch. They first tried to get outside to put out the fire, but the men blocked them. Then the men struggled with the couple to prevent their retreat back into the home as well. The old farmhouse was all dried wood with no fire breaks in the framing inside the walls. The flames spread rapidly down the middle of the house, far quicker than it seemed possible, and neither to the left nor the right. The wall of flame separated the bedrooms from the rest of the house and the front door. Johnny saw the father change his focus from trying to save his home to getting his baby and escaping. Upon turning around, the man couldn't get past the heat, flames, and broken wood separating him from his child, though he tried several times. Johnny was amazed at how quickly the flames began to engulf the home. Johnny looked down in the window where he stood and saw a baby lying in a crib near the window. The room was quickly filling with smoke. He was terrified that the men in the front would come around and catch him, so he had to act quickly. Using a rock he found in the flower bed at his feet, he smashed out the glass on the latched window. Johnny felt a sharp stinging pain as his arm slid along one of the broken shards still in the window frame. It left a gash about 3 inches long, but he didn't have time to react. A small piece of the glass fell into the crib, leaving a small gash on the baby's forehead. Johnny carefully brushed away the glass and scooped up the baby, blankets and all. The men were still full of rage and alcohol, and the fire was already spiraling out of control. There was nothing more Johnny could do, and yet he couldn't just walk away. The baby's father had been calling out, "My baby, dear Lord, my baby." His wife had collapsed on the floor and was crying in great despair. Then, for a brief moment, Johnny made eye contact with the baby's father through the flames and collapsed framing and just stood there staring. The man must have known what Johnny was thinking, for he tearfully yelled out, "It's too late, son, run! Save my baby girl! Save my baby! Take care of her, boy, run!" The men never heard a thing over the roar of the flames and crackling wood. Never did a scared jackrabbit run as fast as little Johnny ran. He zigzagged around the trunks, ducked under the branches, and leapt over the stumps. His heart raced as he was panting heavily. As Johnny neared the woods, he needed to slow his pace. He couldn't let up until he was safely home, but he couldn't risk sprawling over an unseen tree root. He kept low to the ground with his left arm forward and leading with his left leg to feel for obstacles. He was now quite far from the burning house and saw that nobody followed them. He took a moment to calm himself and proceeded on with less speed and more caution. After a couple 100 yards, Johnny came to a place where the canopy of trees opened and let in some of the moonlight. Blood was trickling down his arm and dripping from his elbow, so he wrapped the wound with one of the blankets from the baby's bundle. The baby's cut was no more than half an inch long. He wrapped the baby better in other blankets and lightly pressed one corner of the wound with his finger to stop the bleeding. He could still feel his pulse through his entire body. The adrenaline was wearing off so that his legs began to feel very shaky and his stomach was nauseous. He kept pushing forward. There was no sense in stopping to recover. He had to get back to the orphanage. Miss Johnson was already outside looking for Johnny in the dark. She'd been very worried and was about to phone for the police. She couldn't see him very well in the dark, but she heard him calling out for her as he came running. Miss Johnson knew that there was something wrong by the sound of his voice and the speed he was running. She didn't know what it was, but she ran out to meet him. He nearly ran headlong into her and staggered back. She went to grab him and found a screaming baby pressed into her arms instead. Eliza sat there with wide eyes, amazed to hear this account. Miss Johnson stopped to catch her breath. She almost forgot that Eliza was there listening as the story unfolded. She needed to rest for a moment before continuing. She was about to start again when Eliza Beth asked, "Aren't you going to tell me? What happened to the baby, the one Johnny saved?" Miss Johnson couldn't help but laugh at this comment, and then she exclaimed, "Why, Eliza Beth, don't you realize, child? You are that baby." After that, Eliza's jaw fell open, and she sat there, unmoving and unblinking for the longest time. "You must realize, Eliza," Miss Johnson explained. "The people who did this terrible thing are still important people who continue to get away with things they shouldn't. I didn't know what to do, but I didn't want to turn you over to the likes of them. Who knows if they'd have done right by you or not? I don't think they would have then, and I don't think they would now. For better or for worse, I decided to secretly keep you in the home. I couldn't go asking about you or your family or anything, for fear the wrong people would get word of your surviving the fire. We kept you and told the other children no more than what was necessary. The children know that we could all be in danger if people learned of your presence here. Your secrecy is one rule no one would dare to break. It dawned on Eliza that she'd seen her house. The same house had startled her while looking for the park. A creepy feeling ran down her spine. She understood a little why they hadn't told her all these years, because even though she'd turned 7, it still didn't make sense to her. She now knew that some men had killed her parents, but she didn't understand why. She thought, just because the city grew up around our home? What kind of a reason is that anyway? Johnny risked his life to save me, and Eliza shouted out as she touched the middle of her forehead. The scar! The scar! That's where Johnny got his scar, and mine, that's how I got this scar. Yes, dear, Miss Johnson said. I know that's a lot to think about. She patted her on the shoulder and smiled softly. Eliza was feeling all sorts of emotions about Johnny, her parents, the bad men, and the fire. So many emotions all at once, and she could hardly make sense of it all. The questions would come, but for days afterwards she was very quiet and thoughtful. She was so happy to know how much Johnny loved her, and then she cried over the injustice of it all. Her heart was on a roller coaster of emotions. Miss Johnson gave her attention when it looked like she needed it. It took a few days for it all to sink in and for her appetite to return in full strength.